I want to welcome you this morning to Psalm 99 and to say that I changed the name of the psalm still this morning. So, a little bit about the process. When I get the text, it's actually a text with an English translation from England, and it's a bit dated. The whole thing needs being reorganized, both in terms of how the Hebrew is, as well as retranslating. It's only like my second time through that I give it a title. This may be the first time where I have retitled it the morning of. So this morning, the title will be Holy is Adonai our God, a phrase that will appear 3 times as a refrain in Psalm 99. And in this repetition, some will see the echo of the prophet Isaiah 6:3, which is Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. And so I renamed it this morning, where previously what you received was the title Exalt Adonai our God. And that's because the part of this psalm that is presented as part of Kabbalat Shabbat every Friday night, the part that's most commonly sung is the Romamu. Romamu Adonai Eloheinu. And it's also sung, Romamu, when you take the Torah out of the ark from our psalm. So the most famous line is this line. It appears twice, verse 5 and verse 9. But that same line, Romamu, also concludes Kadoshu, God is holy, or Ki Kadosh, Adonai Eloheinu. And the focus of Psalm 99 is primarily, as I read it and look to share it with you, is primarily about God and a description as to the nature of God, rather than our own exaltation. And so in that light, the choice of the name for the psalm focuses on God. Holy is God. And with that, again, I pause to look out and to delight in seeing people coming on, but we'll go right to the psalm this morning and read it together. Even here, I was, it's kind of like last moment, but with fresh eyes, rewriting the psalm in terms of particularly punctuation. I'll come back and share some of that. A comment before, again, I read it. These Psalms 93 to 99 continue a same theme. And the theme, and that's in part why they're chosen for Friday night by the mystics of Tzfat, is that these are Psalms that acknowledge God as King. And on Shabbat, completion, on Shabbat, creation is complete, God is enthroned, and our prayers, the rabbis teach, create the crown. And so what the Psalms of Kabbalat Shabbat have in common, among other things, is as Psalm 99 begins, a proclamation that God reigns. But the word for God, and we've seen in Psalms there are many names for God, but the name that is used here, the Yud He Vav He, which I will point out, is repeated 7 times. And again, the choice of numbers of the use of a name is very important in the Bible. Wholeness, completion. The name Yud He Vav He is distinctly the name for God in relationship with Israel, so that this opens as a psalm that was sung at the temple, acknowledging the place of God's temple as the center of communion with God on the earthly plane, and acknowledging at the same time as the psalm opens that the God that is being honored as king, Malach, Melech, is of the whole earth. Tanut haaretz, the whole earth shakes. And for purposes of the envelope, Adonai, God's intimate name, is at the beginning and at the end, and punctuated between are these three refrains of holy is God. And that will be also how the psalm is divided. Verses 1 to 3 will focus on the nations of the world. 1 to 3, above all peoples, in verse 2, the earthquakes. Verses 1 to 3 have this quality of the universal God. And that ends with Kadoshu, holy is God. 4 and 5. One moment. Four and 5 will focus on God's relationship as the God of justice and judgment. And so that's a shift. But actually, verses 1 to 5, the verses 4 and 5 is a subset of the nature of God in the world. And then the final section is verses 6 to 9. And here the focus is on Israel's relationship, and doing so through three historic figures: Moses, Aaron, and Samuel. And I'll talk a little bit more, particularly about Samuel, who we're not used to hearing much about, and why in this psalm those three, Moses, Aaron, and Samuel. All right, so with that as the division, again, with it ending with holy is God, three different sections. Adonai reigns. People tremble. Enthroned upon cherubim, the earth quakes. Adonai is great in Zion and exalted above all peoples. They praise your name. Great and awesome, holy is God, and a mighty king who loves justice. You have established uprightness, judgment, and justice in Jacob you have made. Exalt Adonai our God and bow down at God's footstool. Holy is God. Moses and Aaron with God's priests, and Samuel with those who call upon God's name. They did call upon Adonai, and God answered them. In a pillar of cloud, God spoke to them. They observed God's testimonies and statutes that God gave to them. Adonai our God, you answered them. A forgiving God you were to them, yet an avenger of their misdeeds. Exalt Adonai our God, and bow down to the mountain of God's holiness, for holy is Adonai our God. So this word, let me start with this word holy, because it's a key motif. Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. We hear the angels chanting in the celestial choir of Isaiah chapter 6. That is extolling God as other. And when in our prayers, as part of our Kedusha in the Amida, when we say Kadosh, 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 we go up on our toes each time to choreograph the message that God is elevated. And so to say that God is holy is to say that God is worthy of praise, that God is other, that God is elevated. And yet we have the charge in Leviticus 19:2. Kedoshim tihiyu ki kadosh Adonai Elohechem. You shall be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy. And so also throughout this psalm is the notion that the qualities of holiness are attributes that we should aspire to have in our own life, in our own way of being in the world. There's another quality to Kadosh, and that is if you think of the tabernacle itself, which will be referred to here in the first verse, when they were carrying that tabernacle to Jerusalem, it was holy, it was an extension of God, and those who touched it died. And so in my letter describing Psalm 99 and focusing on the nature of God, I talked about the paradox that we'll say more about in Psalm 99 of God being the one who answers and yet at the same time the one who chastises. God who is above the earth, and yet the footstool of God is in the earth. And so this quality of paradox, this quality of complexity to God is conveyed. And with that, we'll start over. We'll start at the beginning. And that is, we acknowledge God as sovereign, and as a result, people tremble. Now, why and when? This psalm, like the previous psalms, is widely read as a psalm at the end of days, when all peoples will come to know the truth that God reigns. And so there are those who say that this is a psalm like Sforno that will be recited on the final day of judgment. A psalm both of some trepidation, because it is the day of judgment, and rejoicing, because God is a trustworthy judge. The cherubim here are the image of the ark. And yet, also, there is the image in Isaiah chapter 66, verse 1, that the earth is God's footstool, not just, if you will, the holy ark. More commonly, it is Zion, Lamentations chapter 2, verse 1, the temple or the ark, Psalm 132:7, 1 Chronicles 28. And so here in the opening already, there's a multiplicity of possible interpretation. Enthroned upon cherubim could either be, with that expression of the earth being God's footstool of Isaiah 66, that God is enthroned over the earth, and therefore the earth quakes, or this could be a psalm sung in the temple with reference to the ark itself. By the way, the cherubim are not the sweet angelic beings that we normally think of them. As the cherubim are described in Exodus chapter 25, verses 18 to 22, they are the body of a lion with large wings and a human face. As one commentator called the cherubs, celestial steeds. There's a fierceness to these protective angelic beings on top of the ark, made from gold, or again, the earth. Adonai is great. So we're now in this context of being Bahar Habayit, at the temple, as this song is sung. Adonai is great in Zion, exalted above all peoples. And again, this tension between God being universal, but a special relationship with Zion and the people of Israel. For the people of Israel, Yodu Shimcha, they praise your name. And here is what they say, at least as I chose to put it in quotation marks and then was delighted to find it put in quotation marks by another translation. Great and awesome, with this emphasis, holy is God, and a mighty king who loves justice. We've seen this as the reoccurring theme, that God's greatness is God's love of justice. I will add, and I always think of Irene Lancaster with her writing on Ibn Ezra, that here in verse 4, we don't, of course, have in Hebrew capitalizations. So Ibn Ezra, who's in the minority but is, an important voice, understands this as and a mighty king, meaning a human king, not capitalized, who loves justice. And precisely because when there is a human king who loves justice, then God establishes that king. For God will establish uprightness, judgment, and justice. So again, I just always love the ambiguity of how translation is interpretation. I chose to do this as a name for God, Oz Melech. Some do it as a small m, and then most do a capital K, but not all. Again, Ibn Ezra has a small k. And now that famous refrain, verse 5, famous because we recite it in our prayers. It's also said in Psukkah, it's said earlier as well in our prayers, and that is Romamu Adonai Eloheinu v'hishtachavu lahadom raglav kadosh hu, which is repeated in verse 9 with a change. Here it is bow down lahadom raglav, at God's footstool, and in 9 it will be bow down to the mountain of God's holiness, which again leads some to understand what is God's footstool. It's the holy mountain. That's another possibility. It can be the earth, it can be the holy mountain, it can be the temple, it can be the ark itself. And now, history, the transition to remembering God's responsiveness. For this psalmist, as God responded to pleas in the past, so God will respond. Now, Moses pleaded with God after the golden calf to forgive the people of Israel, Exodus chapter 32. Aaron, he would plead to God to stop the plague that was consuming the people with snakes, Numbers 17. And the prophet Samuel, in 1 Samuel chapter 7, would plead for God to release Israel from Philistine control. And so that's one way these three are linked. They are all intercessors for Israel, whom God answered. And at the same time, all three would be punished by God. Moses and Aaron at Mei Merivah, the place of conflict with God for not honoring God's name. And Samuel would be punished also later on because he would, at least as understood by the rabbis, because he would refer to himself as a spokesperson for God, as if he had hubris. Samuel, of course, is the important prophet who will appoint the kings. Moses, Aaron, and Samuel all have in common that they are also simultaneously prophets and priests. When was Moses a priest? Coming up when I do the Parshat HaShavua for Mimi's group, we'll be learning about the clothing of the priests, and it's Moses who will dress his brother Aaron and install him as priest. And the commentaries say, well, up until that installation, Moses was priest as well as Aaron. And likewise, Samuel is of a priestly family, and they are all prophets. Moses and Aaron with God's priests, and Samuel with those who call upon God's name. They did call upon Adonai, and God answered them. And so we have a history of God being responsive. And in a pillar of cloud, God spoke to them. Now here Ibn Ezra takes a position that this verse 7 only refers to Aaron and Moses, because the cloud was over the Mishkan, the Ohel Moed, the meeting place in the desert. But others point to 1 Samuel chapter 9, verses 10 to 12, when Saul, the king, when searching for Samuel, he would come to his house and there would be a cloud over his house, as if that signified communion with God. But here too, there is a difference of opinion regarding verse 7. But what is commonly and together understood, in a pillar of cloud, God spoke to them, which meant God can speak, has spoken to our heroes in the past. They observed God's testimonies and statutes that God gave to them. So they were obedient to God. Adonai, our God, you answered them. That's the hope. God will answer us. A forgiving God, you were to them. El Noseh, literally Noseh means uplifting, lifted up their sins, to move those sins away. Yet an avenger, Nokem al alilotam, an avenger of their misdeeds. So here's another tension. We have here in verses 6 to 8 the image of God being responsive, and was to Moses and Aaron and Samuel. But who in our day is a Moses and Aaron or Samuel, let alone are we? And so there too, there's a tension. Okay, the precedent was set for the mighty heroes, but who are we? Or it can be understood, they were our representatives. And this is not a description about us. This is a description about God. And yet, each of these, Moses, Aaron, and Samuel, were also punished by God, and severely. So the event for Moses and Aaron was Numbers 20:11, the being told you will be punished. And some say it might even included the death of Aaron's sons, Leviticus 10. And Samuel, he in 1 Samuel 9, verse 19, he will have said of himself, Anochi haroeh, I am the one of vision. Another word for a prophet. And for that he would be punished. And so here too, this quality of God, that God is kind, God is forgiving, and yet can be strict in judgment. And even more so, for those who are elevated, if you will, a greater sensitivity to wrong. As one rabbi framed it, when you're dealing with iron, you weigh it by the ton. When you're dealing with gold, you weigh it by the ounce, which is to say those who are most refined, Moses, Aaron, and Samuel, for one wrong act had severe punishment. And yet, we pull together the psalm. Romamu Adonai Eloheinu, exalt Adonai our God, v'hishtachavu, and bow down, supplicate, demonstrate your obedience, your respect, lahar kadsho, on the mountain of God's holiness. Ki kadosh, for holy is Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai our God. To pull this together, this psalm takes us through most of Kabbalat Shabbat, 95 to 99, then Psalm 28 for Friday. We're on a journey where these psalms are each distinctive in emphasis and at the same time connected. They're connected by extolling God as sovereign, and consistently what that equals is God is the creator. That's the source of power. But more, God is to be extolled as a just judge. Just, so that even those that were closest to God, Moses, Aaron, Samuel, would get punished when they failed to live up to holiness. And that's the key motif. Holy is Adonai our God. What does it mean to be holy? We're talking about Shabbat. Here's the 3 steps of holiness. The first and only thing in creation called holy is Shabbat, is time. It's not a holy place. It's rather the holiness of time. And what is it that makes Shabbat holy? It's separated out from the other 6 days. In fact, as the Masoretes would give chapter and verse to the Bible, they would take the 7th day and put it at the beginning of chapter 2, separating out the first 6 days from the 7th day. So separation. Second is the sense that on the 7th day, there is synergy. All the parts come together to be more than the sum total. What did God create on the 7th day? The awareness of completion, the awareness of wholeness, that all the parts fit together and create a beautiful tapestry. And last, the 3rd step is that holiness elevates us closer to seeing the world through God's eyes. And so what do we see? We see the beauty of creation. We see the world as whole. And then we see the world through the eyes of a God of justice who still demands that all need to be judged with equity, equally, with kindness, but also with strictness when there is wrong. And so the great religious challenge, Kadoshim Tihiyu, you shall be holy, does not conflict with the first of the 10 commandments. I am God, you are not. That's the first command. To be holy is not to be God. Rather, it is to strive to see the world through God's eyes, to see in time holiness, to see in justice making holiness, to see in the balance of forgiveness and strict judgment holiness. And so Psalm 99 is the psalm for Thursday in Kabbalat Shabbat. It puts us on the cusp of moving toward our own taste in time of holiness, in which we move from not only God as sovereign, for whom the whole world will one day recognize and enable a unity, but in every moment, the opportunity to see goodness, wholeness, and holiness in our own world. So with that, 10 o'clock straight up, I can honor our honoree, Ahuva Ho, who I am delighted to honor. I'm going to say a few words about Ahuva before she shares a few words. But before I do, since we're still focused on Psalm 99, I invite some reactions or questions about Psalm 99. Holiness is God. Ed, good to see you. Ed, go ahead. I have to unmute.
When I first looked at this this morning, when the comment, the earth quakes, I
Yeah.
immediately wanted to think about the fact that when there is an earthquake or a massive tornado or hurricane, is that, in my interpretation, would be that might indicate that God is angry. And the other thing was the word justice. I think we look at justice, and justice can be interpreted many different ways. We may not agree with what type of justice is meted out. And I know that, for example, when we think of Moses, we think of somebody that we all have tremendous admiration for. And if Moses and Aaron and Samuel if they were punished, what type of punishment would we get for other types of things that we might do throughout our lives?
So those are both great comments. Let me respond to each. First, in verse 1, Adonai reigns, peoples tremble, enthroned upon cherubim, the earth quakes. So you see the parallels, A, B, right? Adonai reigns, enthroned upon cherubim, people tremble, the earth quakes. So there's a sense that here too of anthropomorphism making the earth human-like, and earthquakes. Some understand this, I think Radak, as the earthquakes, as referring to earthquakes, which, by the way, do exist in Israel and in Jerusalem. There have been in the past some serious earthquakes. So back to Ed's comment, for some, an earthquake is seen as God being angry because earthquakes cause damage, buildings collapse, people get hurt. And particularly in antiquity, all too often, natural phenomenon were attributed to an active, angry God. So, but here I don't read it that way because of the context. People tremble before God, and the parallel is that the earth quakes or trembles before God as well, conveying this quality of an integration of all of creation. Now, as to the second item, and that is that of justice, two parts to your comment, Ed. One, of course, not everybody agrees what is just. And that is where God becomes the exemplar of impartiality. And the rabbis will emphasize that the problem with administering justice is both the lack of having all the evidence at times, which God does have, because God knows all. And the second is impartiality, that bribes, blind the eyes of the wise, the Torah will say, and that judges often tend to be swayed even by unconscious biases. So that's part one, that God is, unlike a human judge, truly just, which also includes being strict in judgment. The last part, in terms of your comment and question, Ed, and that is, if God is so severe with Moses, we wonder, for hitting the stone twice to get the water gushing, Moses and Aaron are told, well, your dream will not be fulfilled. You will not enter the promised land. That's very harsh on one level. But there too, as the rabbis will understand it, God judges according to capacity, and that the level of prophetic closeness to God of a Moses and Aaron required a quality of sensitivity, the weighing of gold by the ounce, compared to the rest of us, which is judged by a lesser scale in the eyes of God. Another comment, Elise, go ahead.
Yes.
Good to see you.
This may be really out of left field, But when I heard this, I was impressed, was surprised. Ariel Berger, who I've been enjoying watching very much in the CSP seminars, gave a discussion of Kabbalah. And he had mentioned of the 10 Sephirot, three are above our ability to even imagine, and the seven more understandable, even though they really aren't, Sephirot, that in reality they could govern particular ages of 6,000, 7,000 years. I'm not remembering exactly, but that there was a concept of either co-parallel universe or simultaneous universe. And he was saying that the belief was that we are in the Sephirah of Din, which is strictness. And that was interesting. Again, very esoteric, not something that I'm used to hearing, because as a person, it does seem rather harsh. As Edward said, if Moses, Aaron, and Samuel are judged so harshly,
Yeah.
then we really are in a terrible situation here as
So,
individuals.
so let me pull this together, aware of limited time. So, one, I want to thank you, Elise, for the comments and to honor the fact that they come out of such ongoing learning and listening to Ariel Berger these last few weeks. I too am a student of Kabbalah, of Zohar, and the three Chabad, Chachma, Bina, V'Da'at, that are above represent God's mind. And God's mind is not our mind. The top three Sfirot are considered beyond our comprehension. The lower seven Sfirot are how God is manifest in creation with personality of yin yangs, of balancing qualities. And the only thing I'm surprised by, and I didn't hear the Ariel Berger talk, is that the lower Sfirot, the seventh, if you will, millennia will be Shabbat, and that might be the lowest Sphira, because the lowest Sphira, Malchut, is identified with King David and a messianic era. But Din is toward the top. Din is Gevura, Chesed and Gevura. That would be the second. So I don't know about his order. He may be reversing the order. In sum, back to your key motif. But I heard you sharing primarily, Elise, is Din, judgment. Gevura, which is the other name for that sphira, is restraint, creating a vessel to hold the love. But Gevura means boundaries, and it can mean harshness. So in the Zohar, evil exists in the world as an out of balanced Din, that when Din becomes too strict, too harsh, it's experienced as pain, as even evil. Bottom line, I relate to those Sfirot as popular and valuable archetypes. There is a psychologist, an Orthodox rabbi in Los Angeles named Abner Weiss, who approaches patient care by trying to create balance. You can find his book. I'm drawing a blank on the name, but he uses the seven Sfirot as similar, if you know the concept of enneagrams, qualities that need balancing within a person. And the last thing I would say about it is, as emphasized here, we in the Jewish tradition see justice as entailing punishment, meaning there are rights and wrongs. So it can say in verse 8, Adonai our God, you answered them, referring to Moses, Aaron, and Samuel. A forgiving God you were to them, yet an avenger of their misdeeds. That God is extolled throughout these Psalms as a God of chesed umishpat, of kindness and judgment, and that those two need to be in balance, that it can't always be turning the other cheek, that there are times to call out wrong, and that it deserves punishment, and that that is the nature of God's relationship, even to God's greatest prophets and to the whole of creation. That, as I noted, for some of our sages of the Middle Ages, Psalm 99 is the Psalm of Judgment Day, a psalm that will be sung in the future in celebration of God's rule and God's judgment, which requires both chesed, kindness, mercy, forgiveness, and at the same time, the willingness and ability to say this was wrong and needs to be punished. With that, I want to just turn to honoring our honoree, Ahuva Ho. And I just want to say, whenever I see Ahuva Ho on the screen, which I'm privileged to see on a regular basis for Psalms, I am on guard to be my best out of respect for Ahuva, because Ahuva is a Bible scholar with a PhD from Claremont Graduate School in Bible. She's an author of a variety of books on Tzedakah, the Targum of Safanya, an ebook most recently on Alfana de Samura, and a novel that she wrote just to show her versatility and creativity called Dagger of the Heart, which is a novel about Alfana de Samura that she has demonstrated in her scholarship was a converso Jew in Spain. So I do want to give a moment for Ahuva to say a few words, but I do so to say that she's not only a scholar of Bible, who for 21 years, and on Sundays you can tune in to the teachings that Ahuva does of Tanakh through modern lenses. Can't believe it's 21 years, because I mentioned to Ahuva, I went to her 10th anniversary celebration, and that felt like a long time and a lot of teaching week after week. But she's also a mom of Harel, Ofer, Claire, and grandchildren. And today is, I believe, Emmy's 19th birthday, which makes her your oldest grandchild. So she's not your oldest grandchild, so that's where I hedged that by I believe. So Ahuva, maybe just a few words before the Kaddish about why you love Bible, why you love Psalms. So you got to unmute.
I started studying the Bible really with my father when I was, I don't know, 8, 9, maybe less, maybe 7. In Israel, you start studying the Bible very early, at least when I was a child. The Bible speaks to me. I'm very proud of being part of that tradition. And I just love everything about the Bible, the bad and the good, everything. Psalms is also something very special because it's poetry, because it's ancient, because it tells you a lot of things that in other books you can't get them. I would like to say just a few things about this specific psalm.
Please.
That we have here two motifs that are of reciprocity between God and his people and Israel. And on one, both on a vertical direction. One is there's an emphasis on the communication by speech. You call God, you pray to God. It said, elevate God, write odes to God. It's a lot of speech. And when they call him, he answers. So there's a lot of this reciprocity between God and the people who seek him. The motif is that they say, Romemu, lift him, elevate him, while the people bow down. So God is up there, people are down here, and there is the desire to communicate with this holiness, with this kadosh, through speech, through doing the right thing, as God says, as the psalmist said, that yes, they listened to God, they did his law, they kept his laws. So it's a very positive psalm between God and the people.
Thank you. That added a lot for me, as you always do. And I always look to Ahuva as well when I have an issue with Hebrew grammar or her historic lenses that she brings to her analysis of Nach. So Nevi'im and Ketuvim. Again, I bring it to your attention on Sundays. To the opportunity, the website CBI 18 will have the link to learn Nach with Ahuva. Ahuva, thank you for allowing us to honor you. You honor us with your presence. I now give the opportunity for those who are saying Kaddish to honor your loved ones. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah v'alma divra kirute v'yamlich malchute v'chayechon uvyomechon uvchaye dechol beit Yisrael ba'agala uvizman kari v'imru amen.
Amen.
Yehei Shnei Rabba Mevarach Leolam Omeomaya Yitbarach V'yishtabach V'yitba'ar V'yitromam V'yitnaseh V'yitadar V'yitaleh V'yitalal Shemei Dekudsha B'richu Le'ela Min Kol Birchata V'shirata Tushbechata V'nechemata Damiran Yalma Vimru Amen.
Amen.
Yehei Shlama Rabba Min Shemaya V'chayim Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael Vimru Amen.
Amen.
Osei Shalom Bimromav Hu Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael V'kol Yoshvei Tevel Vimru Amen. I want to thank you all as we now end on Thursday with Psalm 99. Ahuva noted that Psalm 99 is elevating and happy. Psalm 100 is chiseled on the eastern wall of our synagogue, namely verse 2, Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha, bo'u lefanav bernana, serve Adonai with delight, come before God with joyous song. So I look to study Psalm 100 on Tuesday at 9:30. Again, Wednesday is a special event that will be at 12:30 California time, as we will have my wife's cousin, David Lang, who composed a 4-minute classical musical for choral group sung by the Oxford Chorale and performed at Lincoln Center. So that only a few years ago, I will teach at the beginning Psalm 101 for 20 minutes. I'll talk to David about why he chose that psalm to write a musical composition for. And then we'll talk about his process of writing music to psalms and his own love of psalms. So 12:30 Wednesday with David, Pulitzer Prize winning David Lang. So again, thank you each for your comments, for your presence. You put wind in my sails. Thank you. So some goodbyes. Thank you, Ahuva, Mark, and Barbara. Nice to see you on the screen. And from far and wide, whether Ken or Shula, Irene, Elise, Richard, Ed, Jack, Marvin, Jeff, Harris, Robert, Barbara, thanks to each of you for making this your beginning of your day. Be well and Shabbat Shalom.